This is Duke University.
Welcome to the Robert R. Wilson Lecture. Professor Wilson was a professor of political science at Duke University from 1925 to 1975. The lectureship was established by Herman Walker, who was Wilson's student and colleague and also had a most distinguished career in his own right. At the law school, the Wilson Lecture has been given each year over the past 2 years, now this is the third year, by the John Hope Franklin Visiting Professor in American Legal History. And how fitting that this year's Wilson Lecture, which was a tribute by a student to his beloved teacher, is given by Paul Finkelman, who was John Hope Franklin's PhD student at the University of Chicago. My colleague, Paul Hagen, will introduce our speaker. Professor Hagen is a polymath. He received his BA from Haverford, an MA from Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar, a PhD in history from Princeton, and a JD from Yale. He came to Duke in 1985 after several years of clerking and law practice in Philadelphia. He serves as Associate Dean for International Initiatives, among other things. His principal academic interests are contracts, the social history of law, and sports and the law. I give you Professor Hagen.
It is my great pleasure and challenge to introduce Professor Paul Finkelman and his Robert R. Wilson Lecture today. You know you're in trouble when you get the CV of the speaker and it goes to 17 pages. And so the pleasure comes from the opportunity to present a scholar who has accomplished so much and whom I have known and known of for so long and from whom I have learned so much. The challenge is adequately to do that, given that he's written so much on such a broad range of topics without taking too much of your and his time. The challenge starts with his very long academic title. Professor Finkelman is the President William McKinley Distinguished Professor of Law and Senior Fellow in the Government Law Center at Albany Law School. This is a title, I submit, that reflects his academic stature, his deep grounding in history, and his commitment to the use of history in engaging current legal controversies. Professor Finkelman received his BA from Syracuse University and his MA and PhD in history from the University of Chicago, and then was a fellow in law and the humanities at Harvard Law School. For the past 35 years, he has been among the central interpreters of law and slavery in the United States. He is currently the John Hope Franklin Visiting Professor of American Legal History here at Duke Law School, and he is an especially appropriate person to hold this chair because his ties to John Hope Franklin run deep. Of course, like every other scholar who works on the legal history of race in America, he is deeply indebted to Professor Franklin for his pioneering work. But his connections are much more personal. John Hope was his supervisor in the history department at the University of Chicago, and the two remained connected from that time that Professor Finkelman arrived at Chicago until John Hope's death in 2009. In a symbolic act of academic apostolic succession, John Hope was the person who placed Paul's doctoral hood on him. And one can get a sense of the trust that John Hope later placed in Paul from the fact that after John Hope had joined the Duke Law faculty and moved to Durham, he asked Paul to come and take care of his prized orchids while he was away. Following the example of his mentor, Professor Finkelman has not shied away from current controversies. In 2002, he served as the expert witness for the plaintiffs in the Glassroth versus Moore case, the lawsuit over the constitutionality of the Ten Commandments monument that had been placed in the rotunda of the Alabama Supreme Court opinion. 2002 was actually a big year for his involvement as an expert witness because he also testified that same year in a case involving the ownership of the 73rd home run hit by Barry Bonds that year. Perhaps the pairing of these two cases helps him better to understand Lincoln's ability to operate successfully in the workaday world as a railroad lawyer and later as the Great Emancipator. John Hope approached these controversies with a clarity of vision and steel of will, but also with the great dignity and grace of a man who devoted much time and love to the growing of orchids. Professor Finkelman, with comparable clarity of vision and steel of will, comes to these battles with the aggressive combativeness of the high school wrestler he once was. Professor Finkelman is an extraordinarily productive scholar. He's the author or editor of more than 30 books and 150 articles. I deliberately use that phrase "more than" because I have some concern that he might have written another one this morning. These books and articles range from history to law, to history of law, baseball, and most recently, Star Wars. A range that demonstrates the playfulness of his mind and the Sitzfleisch of his deep engagement with the sources. The core of his work, like that of his mentor, has been on the difficult history of race and the law and constitution in this country. He is a particularly important interpreter of the most searing part of that history, the long and brutal experience of chattel slavery. It is a history that continues to bedevil. The threat of secession faced by Mr. Lincoln, the Midwestern railroad lawyer, was far more serious and had, we certainly hope, far more significant consequences than the symbolic online calls for secession that have followed President Obama's re-election. But they may serve as a reminder that, as Faulkner noted, the past is not dead, it is not even past. I look forward with great pleasure and anticipation to Professor Finkelman's Wilson Lecture, How a Railroad Lawyer Became the Great Emancipator.
Thank you. There's just one thing you know, after an introduction like that, I feel like I want to meet this person. Thank you very much, Paul. I should say a couple of things. First, that my chair in Albany, I am the McKinley professor, and people say, why do you have a chair for an Ohio politician? Because in 1867, Major McKinley mustered out of the Ohio Volunteers and went to the closest law school he could find in northern Ohio, which happened to be in Albany, New York. And I want to say a couple of things about John Hope before turning to the topic at hand, because there are a number of people here who know John Hope, but many of you were not here when he taught here. He was a spectacular man as a scholar and as a human being. He was a terrific chef. He raised prize-winning orchids. He was dignified and, quite frankly, almost godlike when he was in the public eye. Trying to cross a convention with John Hope Franklin could take an hour because everyone stopped to shake his hands. I would meet him at conventions, and he'd say, let's go to my room and talk. And an hour later, we would finally get to the elevator. My first encounter with John Hope indicates his importance and power within the universe. He clearly had the force with him. I was a graduate student leaving upstate New York and driving to Chicago. The best way to get there was to cross at Buffalo into Canada and then cross back into Detroit. In those days, I had hair, and it was much longer than it is now, and my beard was much longer, and I had everything I owned in a battered old car, and I got to Detroit, and the border guard asked me who I was and where was I going with all this stuff in your car. And I proudly told him I was on my way to Chicago, where I was going to study history for a PhD at the University of Chicago. And the border guard looked at me and said, do you know John Hope Franklin? And I said, yes, he's going to be my advisor. And I pulled out my letter, and he said, okay. And that was it. Have no idea what that was all about. Nor would John Hope admit to what it was all about. My only suspicion is the border guard had been a history major and ended up as a border guard, and he knew how to ask the right question. The second story is more personal. When I gave my first academic talk at the first Great Lakes Regional History Conference, I always thought it was adventurous that it was titled the First Great Lakes, but it's been going on ever since. I was giving my first talk as a graduate student, and John Hope was giving the keynote. And so I asked him if I could get a ride with him from Chicago over to Grand Rapids. And he said yes. He was leaving at 11 o'clock that morning, and I said, oh, I teach at a community college until 12. I could be back where you could meet me by 12:20. We lived just a few blocks from each other. He in a fabulous brownstone in which he showed me the deed that still had the restrictive covenant saying that it could not be sold to blacks, Indians, Jews, or Eskimos. We always wondered how big the Eskimo problem was in Chicago at the time. And he said, well, what will you do for lunch? And I said, well, don't worry about that. I don't want to hold you up any longer. He came and picked me up in my apartment, in front of my apartment, and handed me a bag with a sandwich he had made and cookies that he had baked. For those of you who've been to graduate school, you know how rare it is for a professor to care whether his students eat or not, much less to cook for them. So it is an enormous honor and a privilege to be able to be here as the John Hope Franklin Professor and to give this lecture. I now want to turn to the question of Abraham Lincoln. I hope there will be time for questions after the talk. I will preempt two of them. I have not investigated the truth of him slaying vampires. And I have not seen Steven Spielberg's attempt at understanding him. In 1948, the great historian Richard Hofstadter, who taught at Columbia, launched what was a frontal attack on the iconic image of Abraham Lincoln. And in this article, he referred to Lincoln as among the world's greatest political propagandists, and he considered him to be a deeply cynical politician. Most controversial was Hofstadter's attack on Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation. He pointed out that Lincoln never seemed to really endorse emancipation. It took him more than a year and a half to issue the proclamation. Even then, he seemed to vacillate in the proclamation, suggesting that he would withdraw it if the seceding states returned to the United States. Lincoln appears in the Emancipation Proclamation in Hofstadter's essay to be a pettifogger, drafting a turgid, almost incomprehensible legal document. I was once asked by a publisher to be the advisor to a set of books for grammar school children on great American documents, and they were going to do the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the Emancipation Proclamation. And I asked the publisher, well, have you read the Emancipation Proclamation? And they said, well, no, but isn't it a important document? And I said, well, before we go for a book for grammar school students, please read it. And they called me the next day and they say, do you have any other suggestions? Here at Lincoln's greatest moment of his life, the president who is perhaps the greatest writer to ever serve in that office, the only competition would have been Thomas Jefferson, Master Thomas of Monticello, a very different person. Lincoln is writing a document that, as Hofstadter says, has all the moral grandeur of a bill of lading. On the surface, these criticisms of Lincoln have great plausibility. And in the end, however, a careful understanding of Lincoln suggests that this is not the case. As a competent, successful lawyer, a student of the Constitution, a man who revered the Constitution, Lincoln came to the presidency understanding that emancipation could not be on his agenda. As he said in his inaugural address, which was essentially a plea to the 7 southern states that purported to have left the Union, he told these 7 slave states, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so." Now, if one wants to criticize Lincoln as not being supportive of emancipation, you start with this statement and say, see, he really didn't want to end slavery. But in fact, this position simply reflects an orthodox, universally understood conception of the American Constitution in 1861. With the exception of a few outliers like Lysander Spooner, there were no politicians, no lawyers, no scholars who believed that the president had any power over slavery in the states or that Congress had any power over slavery in the states. Slavery was a state institution regulated by state law, and there was nothing the national government could do about slavery. Furthermore, even if the national government wanted to do something about slavery, there was the gigantic looming Fifth Amendment, for those of you who have taken con law, the takings problem, because the government cannot take private property without just compensation, and the cost of taking 4 million slaves, valued at perhaps $2 billion in 1861 dollars, never mind what it would be worth today, was simply beyond anything anyone could understand. So when Lincoln says, "I have no lawful right to interfere with slavery," he is simply stating the obvious. It is a solid B+ answer on a con law exam, which I'm sure he could have elaborated to make it an A+ answer. And then he goes on to say that I have no inclination to do so because as a former Whig, as a man who respected the Constitution, he believed he could not simply go beyond the Constitution merely because he wished to do so. This did not reflect Lincoln's lifelong personal view about slavery. As Lincoln said in numerous ways at numerous times, if slavery is not wrong, then nothing is wrong. And Lincoln expressed this view, his hostility to slavery, from the moment he entered politics in the 1830s, when he opposed a proposal in the Illinois legislature to condemn abolitionists, and he was only one of 6 people to vote against that. And then as a freshman legislator in Illinois, he proposed a resolution condemning slavery in which he and only one other member of the legislature voted for. So here is a man who his own law partner described as a little engine of ambition, a man who wanted to get somewhere, a man who had great political ambitions, but nevertheless was willing to confront the entire Illinois legislature as a freshman legislator on the issue of slavery. In his single term in Congress, he would propose an emancipation for the city of Washington, D.C., even though he had no support for it, even though it was a losing argument, even though it might hurt him with his own constituents in Illinois. This is not a man who thought slavery should continue. It was unjust, it was wrong. He would tell a correspondent, "I have always thought slavery was wrong. I cannot remember when I did not so think and so feel. But there is a great difference between feeling slavery is wrong, knowing it is wrong, saying that if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong, and feeling as President of the United States that he can do anything about it. And so Lincoln enters the White House committed to restoring the Union, to bringing the 7 Confederate states back into the Union. And you should understand, especially for those of you who grew up in the South, that the Confederate states seceded over slavery. There is nothing else they seceded over. They did not secede over states' rights. In fact, the documents like the South Carolina Declaration of Secession condemn states' rights because they say Northerners are using states' rights to allow abolitionists to have free speech. They don't want states' rights. What they want is slavery, and they say it in a variety of ways. The Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, says slavery and the belief in the inferiority of black people comprise the cornerstone of the Confederacy. Lincoln understands this, and so Lincoln says, come back to the Union because I have no power as president to interfere with slavery. Lincoln does say he will not allow any new slave states to come in, and for that reason, the Confederate states have no interest in returning. Within a few weeks after taking office, of course, the war has begun. 4 more states, including North Carolina, decide to take the road of treason to declare war on the country they are a part of. Those senators, congressmen, military officers who have sworn an oath to the Constitution instead put on a uniform of another country to attack the Constitution, and the war begins. And immediately slavery is on the horizon. And immediately there are calls for Lincoln to end slavery. He doesn't do anything about this right away because he understands that there are essentially 5 preconditions that must be met before Lincoln can turn to the problem of slavery. The first is constitutional theory. Without a constitutional theory, he does not know where he's going. He has to come up with an answer to his B+ or better con law answer that he has no power to touch slavery. Second, he has to have political support in Congress, because without political support, he can achieve nothing. Third, he has to have popular support in the North, because it makes no sense to go on the road to end slavery and then lose the 1864 presidential election. Fourth, he must secure the loyal slave states, Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, and most of all, Kentucky. Very early on in the war, a group of ministers goes to Lincoln and said, if you will free the slaves, you will have God on your side. And he said, I would like to have God on my side, but I need Kentucky. And when one looks at the map of the United States, one understands this, because a Confederate army in Kentucky would be within 1 day's march of Springfield, Indianapolis, and Columbus, and Harrisburg, 4 northern state capitals. A Confederate army in Kentucky would split the United States in half and shut down the Ohio River as the main transport east to west. Furthermore, while Kentucky is the 3rd largest southern state in terms of population, it has the 2nd largest white population, which will provide soldiers for one side or the other. He cannot win the war if he loses Kentucky, and he cannot emancipate slaves until he understands that Kentucky and Missouri and Maryland are secure. Another way to look at these slave states is that in 1860, there are only 4 real cities in the American South, and 3 of them are Baltimore, Louisville, and St. Louis, all in the loyal slave states. Only New Orleans is bigger than any of these in the Confederacy. And finally, to emancipate the slaves, Lincoln has to win the war. Critics of Lincoln say that the Emancipation Proclamation is the desperate act of a desperate president who has no other way to win the war, and so he'll free the slaves. But in fact, as we will see, and as we see from looking at Lincoln's own correspondence and his own speeches, his view is just the opposite. Emancipation is not the way to win the war. Emancipation becomes the logical fruit of victory in the war. And only when he can win the war can he think about emancipating slaves. Let us start with the constitutional theory. In 1861, Lincoln faces a Supreme Court with 6 justices, all of them appointed by Democrats. And in those days, the Democratic Party was the party of the South, the party of slavery. All of them pro-slavery. 5 of them had been on the Dred Scott Court. The 6th had come along afterwards. If Lincoln does not have a coherent constitutional legal theory to end slavery, he can be pretty sure that the Supreme Court, led by the aging, pro-slavery, fanatically states' rights, seething, nasty, angry Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, will overturn the Emancipation Proclamation. To give you an idea where Taney is sitting, in his papers in the Library of Congress are draft opinions declaring conscription unconstitutional, even though no case ever comes to the court, and a draft opinion declaring the Emancipation Proclamation unconstitutional, even though there is no case to the court. This is a man who would have been a great Boy Scout. He was prepared. He was prepared to undo anything Lincoln would do, and Lincoln understands this. But even with a coherent legal theory, he has to have the support of Congress, because you just don't magically say the slaves are free and they are free. You have to have congressional support. And congressional support has to be backed up by popular support in the North. It is true that Lincoln carries a majority of the voters in every single northern state. It is true that he carries all of the electoral votes of all of the northern states except New Jersey, which is split between Lincoln and Stephen Douglas. But in some of those states, Douglas carries 45% of the vote. In some of those states, he carries 47%. In others, he certainly is in the 40s. Clearly, Lincoln does not have the support of all the people in the North, and he has to have a strong northern majority to go against slavery. Third, as I've said, he has to secure the border states. Without the border states, he cannot hold Washington, D.C., which would be surrounded by slaveholding Maryland. He cannot win the war. With 200,000 slaves in Kentucky, he has to assure Kentucky that Kentucky will not be able or want to leave for the Confederacy before he can begin to think about ending slavery. And this, of course, leads to the precondition that he must be able to win the war. So these are the things that Lincoln faces. Early on in the war, there are a couple of events that lead to emancipation. First, Frederick Douglass makes speeches urging an emancipation of the slaves. He is on the left of the Republican Party. He is pushing for emancipation now. He doesn't want to hear about constitutional issues. Douglass points out that the very stomach of the rebellion is the Negro in the form of the slave. Arrest that hoe in the hands of the Negro, and you spike the rebellion in the very seat of its life. Douglass understands this. Abolitionists understand this. Many Northerners who have never been abolitionists before understand this. But you still have to figure out how to do it. On May 23rd, 1861, shortly after the war begins, 3 slaves owned by Confederate Colonel Charles Mallory escape in Virginia from their Confederate master to Fortress Monroe in Virginia. The next day, the weirdest, oddest, most surrealistic moment of the war probably takes place. A Confederate major, M.B. Carey, in full uniform with sash and sword and white flag, approaches Fortress Monroe and asks the commander of the fort to return these fugitive slaves under the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 and under Article 4, Section 3 of the Constitution. The commander of Fortress Monroe is Benjamin F. Butler. Butler had been a lawyer before the war. He had been a Breckinridge Democrat. That is, he voted for the pro-slavery Democrat in 1860. Butler had never been opposed to slavery until the war began. When the war began, Butler organized the Massachusetts militia. He became what was known as a political general, and Butler was the first Northern commander to reach Washington, D.C. after the war began. He brought his troops down by train to Baltimore. When they got to Baltimore, they had to change trains because the trains from the north went to one station, the trains going south went to another station. He could not get across Baltimore because of the pro-slavery secessionist mobs. This is one of the reasons why Lincoln has to suspend habeas corpus in Maryland, because of the pro-slavery mobs, which the governor of Maryland will do nothing about, because the governor of Maryland is trying to decide whether he wants to secede or not. Butler's troops fight their way across Baltimore, where, realizing they can never get to the train station, they are Massachusetts men, they have alternatives, they seize boats and sail into Washington, D.C. That's the first time Butler saves the Union. The second time is at Fortress Monroe. He tells Major Carey to come back the next day because he has to think about this. And so Butler spends the whole day doing what any good general would do. All night, he's studying his books, not as tactical books. He's reading international law. He's reading the rules of war. And the next day, when Major Carey comes in, General Butler tells him that these slaves are contrabands of war and cannot be returned any more than he would return guns or cannon or horses that were found on the battlefield, and that the fugitive slave law did not apply to a foreign country, which Virginia claimed to be, I'm now quoting from Butler's official report, and must reckon it one of the infelicities of her position. I love this phrase. One of the infelicities of her position, that insofar at least she is taken at her word. And therefore Butler would not return these fugitive slaves unless Colonel Mallory would come to Fortress Monroe and take an oath of allegiance to the United States of America, in which case he could have his fugitive slaves back as a citizen of the United States. Colonel Mallory did not do so. The slaves remained free, and Butler had developed the first constitutional theory that would ultimately lead to the Emancipation Proclamation. Because if General Butler could do this for 3 slaves in Virginia, a year and a half later, Abraham Lincoln would conclude he could do it for 3 million slaves in the American South. And so the contraband theory begins to set out how emancipation can legally happen. Meanwhile, the contraband theory does something else, because suddenly hundreds and then thousands of slaves are running to U.S. Army lines. They are not waiting for Lincoln to come up with a theory. They're not waiting for Congress to act. They understand that the war is about them, and they understand that they are going to do something about the war. They are, as historians say, voting with their feet. And as slaves run into U.S. Army lines, a magical transformation takes place. They start as slaves. As 1 foot goes into the U.S. Army line, they become contraband. And as 2 feet go in, they become free people. Because unlike horses or guns or cannon, they are magically transformed from property to person as they enter the jurisdiction of the United States. Now, the Army is not a social welfare agency. The Army cannot feed, clothe, and house these people. But the Army needs workers, and the slaves need jobs. And by the end of 1861, there are probably close to 100,000 African Americans, men and women, working for the United States Army, as well as 20,000 who are in the Navy. And these former slaves have to be fed, they have to be housed, and most of them have to be clothed because they come in rags. And the only clothing the Army has is blue uniforms. So well before Lincoln authorizes the enlistment of black troops, there are probably close to 100,000 blacks in blue uniforms in Army camps doing all of the jobs that soldiers do except go into combat. And we know that when the moment comes and Confederate troops are in your camp, nobody tells the black soldiers, oh, don't pick up a gun and fight. And so, in fact, the first step to emancipation begins in May 1861. In August 1861, Butler's policy is accepted by Secretary of War and by the Army. General Halleck issues an order saying that you should accept all contrabands coming from the Confederacy. Meanwhile, Congress has passed the first Confiscation Act, which allows for the emancipation of slaves precisely as Butler had done so. And we are beginning to see the movement towards the preconditions that Lincoln needs. Then, at the end of August, another general tries a different emancipation tactic. John C. Fremont, who had been the Republican candidate in 1856 for the presidency, is commander of Missouri, and he declares that all the slaves in Missouri are free. Immediately, Lincoln writes to Butler and says, please withdraw this order. You may not have noticed, but Missouri is part of the United States. It is not in the Confederacy. It has not seceded. The Constitution applies, and you can't take private property for public use in this way. Fremont, hoping to get the 1864 nomination, ignores Lincoln, says he will not. In fact, he finally writes back to Lincoln and says, I will not withdraw the order. You should feel free to countermand it if you wish. Lincoln replies, I will cheerfully do so. Meanwhile, Lincoln is getting letters from people all over the North and in Kentucky urging him to countermand Fremont. There is not a day to lose in disavowing emancipation, or Kentucky has gone over the mill dam, writes one politician in Kentucky. Senator Browning of Illinois writes to Lincoln, what are we going to do about this? And Lincoln says, to lose Kentucky is to lose the whole game. Fremont continues to resist, and ultimately Fremont is removed from command and disappears from the political landscape and is not heard from again in any meaningful way. Lincoln has made it clear that if you end slavery, you have to do it in a constitutional manner, and you have to do it carefully. Meanwhile, the abolitionist wing of the Republican Party is not happy with this. People like Charles Sumner complain to Lincoln, but Sumner likes Lincoln. He meets with Lincoln privately, and Lincoln says, look, I am only a few weeks behind you. I am 6 or 8 weeks behind where you are. I will get to where you want to be. In fact, it will take 1.5 years to finally issue the Emancipation Proclamation. But Lincoln is moving in the same direction. The next move, of course, has to be towards the military. And the military situation begins to change in late 1861. Because in late 1861, the United States begins what will be 6 months of extraordinarily military success. It begins in November 1861 when Admiral Samuel DuPont seizes the South Carolina Sea Islands. And the United States Army now sits on South Carolina soil. This is the beginning of the shrinking of the Confederacy. Lincoln cannot know this, but from this point on, the Confederacy will be shrinking slowly but surely. By the end of the spring of 1861, a number of dramatic things have occurred, starting in Tennessee in January and February of 1862. I'm sorry, by the end of spring of 1862, not 1861, things will have changed dramatically. In January 1862, a relatively obscure U.S. Army general moves into Kentucky, and on February 6th, Ulysses Grant captures Fort Henry. 10 days later, he captures Fort Donelson. He now has the major forts on the Tennessee and the Cumberland rivers. And the war has changed permanently. Because instead of a Confederate army about to invade and take over Kentucky, you now have the U.S. Army sitting in Tennessee. Within 6 months, Nashville will have fallen, the first Confederate capital to fall. Baton Rouge will fall, Little Rock will fall, and an obscure place called Pea Ridge in Arkansas, a Confederate general will be defeated by a U.S. Army force half its size, stopping a Confederate invasion of Missouri. And by the spring of 1862, things look pretty good. General Butler will be transferred from Fortress Monroe to be the commander of New Orleans, because New Orleans, the largest city in the South, will be under Confederate control. The Navy will have sealed off every southern port on the Atlantic Ocean except Charleston and Wilmington, North Carolina. And while Confederate ships can get in and out of Mobile, they really have a hard time getting to the Atlantic, getting to England, because they have to go all the way around Florida to do so. Things are looking pretty good. Meanwhile, in Congress, Congress is moving against slavery. Congress passes a law emancipating all of the slaves in the District of Columbia, providing compensated emancipation, because this is a takings, $300 per slaves. Masters complained, but my slave was worth $1,000 just a year ago. Well, you know, there's a fairly big bear market on slaves right now in Washington, D.C., and you really ought to be happy with the $300 you get. Furthermore, the Confiscation Act applies only to slaves that were in Washington, D.C. the day the war began. And there are thousands of slaves in Washington that came in after the war began. They are not compensated for. They are simply emancipated. And so for the first time in the history of the United States Congress has taken a step to end slavery somewhere in the United States. A few weeks later, Congress ends slavery in the federal territories. Then Congress passes a resolution saying that if the loyal slave states will end slavery, Congress will provide money for compensation to masters. Lincoln meets with Southern representatives from Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri, loyal Southerners, urging them to go back to their home states and push for compensated emancipation. Meanwhile, while he's preparing for this meeting, another general gets it in his head that he can be the great emancipator. And David Hunter, the commander of the U.S. Army forces in South Carolina, Florida, and Georgia, declares an emancipation in all of his military district. Lincoln immediately countermands this order, but he does so not on constitutional grounds, not that Hunter doesn't have the power to do this. In fact, in his order, Lincoln says that if and when he decides to free the slaves in these states, he believes as commander-in-chief of the Army, he does have the power to do so. He simply tells General Hunter that major generals don't make policy. Rather, he says, I reserve to myself, and which I cannot feel justified in leaving to the decisions of commanders in the field, the question of when and how to end slavery. He meets with the border state congressmen, and he tells them about General Hunter's order, which everybody already knows about. And he says General Hunter's orders was very popular. People in the North liked this. And he says General Hunter is a good man. He is my friend. Very different from Fremont, who Lincoln cashiers. He understands what's going on, and he tells these Southern loyal slave state representatives that they should take what is offered. They should go back and fight for an end to slavery in their states, because he says famously, otherwise the incidents of war could not be avoided, and mere friction and abrasion will destroy slavery. He says slavery will be gone and you will have nothing valuable in lieu of it. These slave state representatives, most of whom are Democrats, most of whom hate Lincoln, most of whom own slaves themselves, 2 days later publish a public letter denouncing Lincoln and saying that they will never move to end slavery in their states. In the day between the meeting and the publication of the letter, that is that one day in between, because Lincoln leaves the meeting knowing that these people will not support him, Lincoln begins to draft the Emancipation Proclamation. And he privately tells Secretary of State Seward and Secretary of the War Gideon Welles that he is going to issue an Emancipation Proclamation. 4 days later, Lincoln signs the Second Confiscation Act, which, had there not been emancipation by the president, could have eventually ended slavery, but would have been very cumbersome. Congress is on board. He then meets with his cabinet, and he says that he is going to issue an Emancipation Proclamation. All the members of the cabinet agree to issuing it. They are simply concerned about the timing. One of them suggests we wait till after the 1862 midterm elections because it would be politically smart to do so. Lincoln says he will decide that himself. Meanwhile, in New York, the editor of the New York Tribune, Horace Greeley, writes an editorial called A Plea from 20 Million, in which he urges Lincoln to end slavery. Lincoln does something which I believe no other president has ever done. He writes a letter to the editor, and it actually gets published. And in this letter to the editor, Lincoln says that my goal is to preserve the Union. I would preserve the Union if I could by freeing no slaves. I would preserve the Union by freeing some of the slaves and leaving others in slavery. Or I would preserve the Union by freeing all the slaves. My goal is to preserve the Union. And then he says, this represents my official duty and does not change my oft expressed, and here he italicized the word, my oft expressed personal wish that all men everywhere could be free. Now, what is Lincoln doing? Well, first of all, he's being a kind of shifty politician, because he says, I would preserve the Union by freeing none of the slaves. By this time, he's probably freed 150,000 or more. There are a lot. D.C. no longer has slavery. The territories no longer have slavery. Hundreds, thousands, over 100,000 Southern slaves have moved into U.S. Army camps. So to say I would end the war by freeing none of the slaves simply isn't true. He knows where he's going. He's already written the Emancipation Proclamation. It's in his desk. What he is doing is preparing the North, preparing the popular people, preparing for popular support to end slavery. He's saying, look, my goal is to preserve the Union. I'll do what I have to do. But listen, you Northern conservatives. Listen, you people who voted for Stephen Douglas or John C. Breckinridge or the Constitutional Union Party. Listen to you people who are racist and fear black freedom. Let me tell you, when it comes down to it, I will free all the slaves if that's what it takes. Be on notice. He is setting the stage to end slavery. In September, he receives an emancipation memorial from a group of ministers in Chicago. The ministers again beg him to free the slaves, telling him once again God will be on his side. And Lincoln says, I cannot free the slaves till I've secured Kentucky, or I will move 50,000 bayonets out of the U.S. Army into the Confederate Army. And then he says, I cannot free the slaves until I know I will win the war, or it will be like the Pope's bull against the comet. Now, here I have to explain this because this is fairly obscure stuff to us. But in America of 1862, where 90% of the population are evangelical Protestants, everybody knows, that is, they know it's not actually true, but they all know it to be true, that there was a medieval pope that issued a papal bull against Halley's Comet coming to the world. The Pope said, no, you can't come. And of course, it wasn't very effective. And these Protestant ministers from Chicago understand the analogy that I will not be like the dumb Pope that issued the papal bull against the comet. I can only emancipate the slaves when I know I can win the war. He said, otherwise, it will not be worth doing. And of course, a week later, the United States wins a spectacularly important victory at the Battle of Antietam. General Lee's army leaves thousands of dead and captured and wounded soldiers on the field of battle, leaves horses, cannon, guns, gunpowder, none of which the Confederacy will ever be able to replace on the field in Maryland. And 2 days later, Lincoln issues the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation because now he believes he will win the war. In the preliminary proclamation, he says, on January 1st, which happens to be 100 days from the day he issues it, on January 1st, I will free all the slaves unless the Confederate States return to the Union. Now, again, Hofstadter criticizes Lincoln. See, he's giving the slave owners one more chance. But of course, nobody really believes, nobody could possibly believe that the nut jobs in South Carolina, some things don't always change. are ready to return to the Union. After all, Texas still wants to secede. From what the internet says, Rick Perry believes it's one of the three things he wants. He can't remember what the others are, but he knows he wants one of them. Nobody can believe these people are going to come back to the Union in 100 days. But just to make sure that they're not coming back into the Union, Lincoln has done one other thing which secures emancipation. 3 weeks earlier, he had authorized the commanders at Port Royal, General Hunter and his colleagues, to begin to enlist slaves who have been emancipated by the Army on the South Carolina Sea Islands. There are already black men, not as laborers, not as ditch diggers or cooks or hospital orderlies or cemetery crews, but as soldiers wearing blue uniforms, training to use guns. He has put black men in the Army, and Congress approved this in the Militia Act in August 1862. In other words, he knows the Confederates are not going to return to the United States because the Confederates consider that the United States has now gone over any possible line of peace because the United States is now enlisting black soldiers. And so, we can come back to Professor Hofstadter. If we could conjure up Abraham Lincoln, which I suppose will be the next movie, Conjuring Lincoln, and bring him here, and I could tell him, you know, a famous professor at Columbia University said that the Emancipation Proclamation had all the moral grandeur of a Bill of Lading. Lincoln would stand there, up there somewhere. Frederick Douglass described his first meeting with Lincoln. He said, I came into the Lincoln's room, in the Lincoln's office, and he was sitting in his normal way with 1 foot in one corner of the room and 1 foot in the other corner of the room. And he said, he stood up to greet me, and he rose, and he rose, and he rose. Douglas is 6'2", and he's looking up to Lincoln. Lincoln would say, yes, it has all the moral of a grandeur of a Bill of Lading. What was Lincoln before the war? He was a railroad lawyer. And there's nothing more beautiful to a railroad lawyer than a Bill of Lading. Because as we know, a Bill of Lading is what allows you to move goods from one place to the other. In London, the Civil War correspondent for the London Times, who's in London but he's writing about the war, writes that the most formidable decrees he hurls at the enemy, and which will never lose their historic significance, resemble, as the author intends them to, an ordinary summons sent by one lawyer to another. The author of that article was a man named Karl Marx. He understood what Lincoln was doing. And so in the end, when all the preconditions were met, when the border states were secure, when the Northern public had finally come around, when Congress was in place and a military victory seemed likely, and he had a constitutional and legal framework, Lincoln went back to his roots as a railroad lawyer, and he issued a Bill of Lading, not for the delivery of goods, but for the delivery to freedom of 3 million people in the Confederacy. And so late at night during this sesquicentennial of the Civil War, when you are up at night and you can't sleep and you turn on the TV and all you get is Gone with the Wind. And you see Scarlett O'Hara moaning about Tara being destroyed. And you see General Sherman on his glorious march from Vicksburg to Charleston and then up the coast. Keep in mind that in front of General Sherman's army are invisible cherubim carrying a banner which says, all people who come behind this army are free. And keep in mind that General Sherman's march to the sea is the greatest liberation of human beings in the history of the world until the Allies march on Berlin. And what they are doing is fulfilling Abraham Lincoln's wish, stated in his letter to Greeley and put into the Emancipation Proclamation that all men everywhere could be free. Thank you. I think we have time for questions.
How much of a role do you think was played in holding him back by the significant disloyalty among certain elements in the North, particularly in the Midwest?
Well, there's some disloyalty in the Midwest, and there's certainly the fear in the Midwest, the lower Midwests, southern Illinois, which is where Lincoln was from, and southern Indiana, where he grew up, that those people, most of whom were Southerners by birth, like Lincoln, or Southerners once removed, would not support emancipation. And there was some Northern opposition to emancipation in that part of the country. And there was some opposition in New York City, particularly among Irish immigrants who feared that they would be displaced by cheaper black labor. But I think by and large, his main concern is with securing Kentucky and the other border states, knowing he'll win the war, and having the vast majority of Northerners support him. The reality is, as Lincoln knows, he's not going to win congressional seats in southern Illinois, whether he emancipates the slaves or not. Yes?
So to finish the story, what happens in Kentucky?
Well, what happens in Kentucky is that Kentucky does not accept the offer, and then after the Emancipation Proclamation, Congress authorizes the enlistment of black troops everywhere in the country. U.S. Army recruiters go plantation to plantation to plantation, signing up slaves as soldiers, and some Kentucky masters get the enlistment bounty. If you're a smart Kentucky master, you say, okay, I'll take the $100 enlistment bounty, you're free to enlist. Then Congress turns around and makes it a crime to hold in slavery the parents, wives, or children of any U.S. soldier. And so the husbands, wives, and daughters all get free, and mothers and fathers all get free that way. And so in the end, Kentucky abolishes slavery on its own. Oddly enough, the one northern state that doesn't abolish slavery on its own is Delaware, which had almost no slaves to begin with. But this also illustrates the sticking power of slavery. In the end, Delaware and Tennessee and parts of the South that were not included in the Emancipation Proclamation will see emancipation through the 13th Amendment. It is worth remembering that without secession, the 13th Amendment could never be passed. It takes 3/4 of the states to pass a constitutional amendment. If the 15 slave states were still in the United States today and still had slavery, we would need 45 free states and a 60-state union to pass a constitutional amendment to end slavery. Southerners understood that slavery was in the Constitution to stay forever. Yes, sir.
How do you explain Lincoln's deference to the Constitution with the way he suspended habeas corpus and imprisoned dissenters during the war?
Okay, well, the habeas corpus suspension, I think, is pretty easy. The Constitution says, writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended except in time of rebellion or invasion. Clearly, there's a rebellion going on. Somebody has to suspend the writ of habeas corpus. The opponents of Lincoln make the claim, well, because the suspension clause is in Article 1, that means only Congress can suspend habeas corpus. But by that token, the fugitive slave law was unconstitutional because it was in Article 4. You can't have it both ways. If Congress only has, if Article 1 is powers of Congress, and that's only Article 1, then what do you do with powers of Congress elsewhere? But more importantly, can we really imagine that the framers of the Constitution believed that habeas corpus could only be suspended if Congress was in session, when they envisioned that Congress would be in session for 2 or 3 months a year? If Lincoln doesn't suspend habeas corpus, Congress can never be in session because people like John Merriman are blowing up the railroad bridges and destroying the railroad tracks, which would lead Congress through Maryland to get to Washington, D.C. The problem is there are no federal laws. There's no federal police force. There is nothing to stop pro-Confederate terrorism in Maryland or New Jersey or Kentucky or Missouri, short of the Army. The job of stopping people from tearing up railroads belongs to the governor of Maryland. Governor of Maryland will not do anything. Governor of Kentucky eventually leaves Kentucky and becomes a Confederate general. He isn't going to do this. So without suspending habeas corpus, you cannot maintain the government. The fact is, Congress comes into session in July, and the first thing it does is approve of the suspension of habeas corpus, and then subsequently passes a much larger habeas corpus suspension act that would apply to everywhere in the North. By and large, Lincoln authorizes the arrest of relatively few people for what we would consider civil liberties issue. There are a fair number of people who are arrested for evading the draft or for being deserters. But there are relatively few arrests for things like free speech. Usually they're done by generals, and almost always Lincoln writes the general. In one case he says, would you please relieve me of the embarrassment of arresting newspapermen and let these people go? On the other hand, there is no free speech in the Confederacy. And even though it's a far smaller region of the nation with far fewer people, there are far more people arrested on what we would consider to be traditional civil liberties violations. So I think the answer is Lincoln believes that that the Constitution authorizes the suspension in time of actual rebellion. This was actual rebellion. Yes?
How would you say we should juxtapose Lincoln's legacy as the Great Emancipator with his views on social equality? Do you think that they're at all contradictory?
You know, it's a hard thing to get our heads around. Lincoln is a person of his times. Lincoln is a man who grows up in a world, first Kentucky, then southern Indiana, then southern Illinois, where blacks have no equality, virtually no rights whatsoever. They're not even allowed theoretically to move into Indiana and Illinois. When asked about social equality while running for public office, Lincoln says he's opposed to social equality. He wants to get elected. He probably at one level believes it. During his debates with Douglas accuses him of being in favor of interracial marriage, and Lincoln responds by saying, I'm nearly 50 years old and I've managed to live my entire life without ever having a black woman as a slave or a wife, and I can do that for the rest of my life. And then he turns to Douglas, but he says, Douglas, since you're so worried that you might marry a black woman, I'll keep those laws on the books for you. Now, the fact is interracial marriage is not the political issue of the day. The political issue of the day is emancipation. He says he's opposed to blacks voting in 1858. His last public speech is an endorsement of black suffrage. He says he's opposed to social equality. He invites Frederick Douglass to have lunch with him at a time when the greatest taboo after interracial marriage would be for a white person to have lunch with a black person. He invites Douglass to the White House and asks him for his advice. In the middle of this meeting, the governor of Rhode Island shows up, and he's announced, and Lincoln says, please tell the governor I'm busy with Frederick Douglass. Douglass writes in his autobiography, this is the first time a person of low stature like me is kept on meeting with the president while somebody high like the governor is left waiting. What Douglass is really saying, this is the first time that a president sits down with a black man and has a serious conversation and makes a white guy wait. So what you have to do, I think, with somebody like Lincoln is see change over time, understanding that if we take his words from even 1865 and bring them to today, he would not be a racial egalitarian. But also understanding that in his lifetime, he is fairly extreme in favoring black equality. At one point, Douglass says, blacks are unequal. And Lincoln says, yeah, they're unequal in lots of ways, he says, but in what they earn with their own hands, they're my equal and Douglas's equal. Now, that's a pretty extreme position in Illinois when you're running for Senate in 1858. It's also worth knowing that in those debates, Lincoln always uses the word Negro, except on one occasion when he kind of tells a joke and uses another N-word. Douglass uses, and I will use the word because we shouldn't shy away from history, Douglass uses the word nigger in every one of his talks all the time. And in those days, it is just as offensive as it is today. Lincoln does not. That tells us something about the difference of politics of the time. So I think the question when you're dealing with a historical figure is not to say, can we take his words then and apply them to our world? But we first have to ask, where does he stand in his world and where is he headed in his world? The fact is he's headed towards complete end to slavery and black enfranchisement. And that puts him in a fairly small group of white people at any time, I would say before the mid-20th century. Thank you.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.